Hey, Tom, what does the movie The Man Whose Mind Exploded, Great Gardens, Fetish Untied, Sploshing, Alien Sex Party, and the new King Crimson documentary all have in common?
Well, that would be director Toby Amies.
And guess who's on our show tonight?
Toby Amies.
That's correct. Guys, listen, this is a great interview. We had so much fun with Toby. And we talked all things King Crimson, and we, as usual, diverted the way we normally divert. And Tom, tell us about how great this was.
This was a really insightful interview. This is a must-see documentary, not only for King Crimson fans, but for rock fans. It is not your atypical rockumentary with lots of music and backstage celebrity backslapping and the usual debauchery. This is a really deep, deep dive into what makes King Crimson tick. And of course, it's all centered around Robert Fripp, who has been not only the founder, but the only constant in King Crimson. The name of the documentary is entitled In the Court of the Crimson King, King Crimson at 50, and they actually celebrated their 50th anniversary in 2019, and that's when this documentary was filmed, thereabouts 2018, 2019, on their 50th anniversary tour, which was a remarkable trek. They intersperse some really great archival footage. There's not much out there of King Crimson, but wonderful interviews with Trey Gunn, who we've spoken to, with Ian McDonald, and also with Tony Levin, who is in the current lineup of King Crimson. And, of course, I think there's a couple of snippets with Greg Lake in there, and also great interview footage with Bill Bruford, among others.
Adrian Belew as well.
Right. And I think, Adrian Belew is in there. Sour Grapes, Adrian Belew, as you mentioned. Interesting that David Singleton observed of the film, that is the King Crimson's manager, who is also in the documentary, all of life is here, not just music, and certainly not just rock. It has been rightly described as going beyond King Crimson into a universal inspirational study of what it is to work and what it is to dream as an artist. And that's pretty much sums up this film. Toby takes us behind the scenes. It was a difficult documentary to film, as he admits. Toby is also a rock and roller. He was a bass player, David, in a punk rock band.
Yes, he was.
Look at that. See how much we have in common.
And he played a Rickenbacker copy with a neck that would probably be better suited for skiing than bass playing.
Of course. That's how bass players begin. But this is a wonderful documentary. The DVD version will be out by the time you hear this in November 2022. And you're going to get 2-disc, a Blu-ray DVD set. There is an 8-disc box set containing 2 Blu-rays, 2 DVDs, and 4 CDs. And it's the full documentary film, an early edited version of the film, which Toby will discuss, and the final performance of the classic Starless from the band's final ever concert in Tokyo, Japan, December 2021. So this is a must-have for King Crimson fans. And a fascinating note to all prog rock fans and rock fans in general. This was a real spectacular work of art. So let's get on. Let's talk to Toby, David.
Before we do that, I want to let the folks know that we've made a little bit of a change in how we do our music, including in our interviews.
Right.
So what we're going to start doing now is showing the interview or playing the interview from beginning to end and then lumping all of the songs together. So this works great on our radio show, and it works even better on our podcast, also called Notes from an Artist. And where can you find the Notes from an Artist podcast, Mr. Semioli?
Well, funny you mention it, David, because it's available. All podcasts are potted. That would be Spotify, Apple, Amazon, Buzzsprout, and all of the other platforms. So yes, absolutely. If you are listening to this on the podcast, just click on the aforementioned playlist, which is at the bottom. And for those of you folks listening to us on the radio, that old school radio, following our interview, we'll have a wonderful playlist of tracks from King Crimson, from Robert Fripp, from Ian McDonald, and from all of the other little side projects. Let's bring in Toby.
What happens when 2 bass road warriors spend quality time talking music and life with one of their peers? Bassist, educator, author David C. Gross and bassist and head honcho of KnowYourBassPlayer.com, Tom Semioli, trade dates with the legends of rock, jazz, funk, blues, folk, country, and more. Notes from an Artist, revealing conversations with the legends who've created the soundtrack of our lives. What happens? You're about to find out. It's another episode of Notes from an Artist.
Welcome to Notes from an Artist, Toby. Welcome, sir. David, our guest is Toby Amies. The documentary is King Crimson in the Court of the Crimson King. King Crimson at 50, David. Can you believe that? Toby, what's a nice guy like doing hanging out with King Crimson? How did you get involved with it?
They begged me.
I'm sure Fred begged you.
Well, no, he didn't. Robert didn't beg me, but how the film came about was that my parents lived on the same street as Robert and Toya.
Oh, okay.
And so I met Robert and Toya socially, and I'd sent them my first film, The Man Whose Mind Exploded, and they both liked that very much. And I have an unusual approach to documentary making, which is, it's very subjective, but it's so subjective that you become aware that a film is being made. So there's a sort of inherent honesty, I suppose, in that approach. And I think that might have been part of the appeal to Robert. I think that certainly he felt like I was not going to make a traditional rock documentary. So, and also I didn't know anything about King Crimson really before I started, although I have an extensive background in music, and I used to work for MTV for a long time, and I've worked for various, for record companies, and I've also been a DJ for, I don't know, 30 years or so. So music is my first love. Cinema is my passion.
Now, it's interesting. I'm glad you caught King Crimson at this point in their career. It kind of strikes me very similar to what Martin Scorsese did with the Rolling Stones, Shine a Light, which I think goes back to about 2008, that you see the Stones, then in their present day, and you see King Crimson in their present incarnation. Now, obviously, the Stones were a little more consistent than Crimson when it came to personnel and recording. But this is an amazing glimpse into King Crimson. It's almost like you're a fly on the wall during their performances.
Or more a fly in the ointment,
yeah.
I think might be how Robert saw it. Yes, I mean, it's sort of the reason, but I want to make clear, it's not really a film about the current incarnation of King Crimson as much as it is a film that uses the current incarnation to give the audience a sense of what it might have been like to be in King Crimson at any point in the band's varied histories. So it's important for me I wanted to make something that was cinema as opposed to television. Right. And so it was important to keep the audience in the moment as much as possible. And that obviously is one of the themes of the film anyway. So because the current band is active, that was an opportunity for me to watch members of King Crimson at work. But at the same time, I attempt to fold ex-members of the band in as well, both to make reference to how the band's changed over time, but also, ideally, I have the most appropriate member of the band talking about a particular element of the band at the right time, I suppose.
It's interesting just to see. I tell you, there's so many things to take away from this film. One of the things is what an incredibly sensitive man Robert Fripp is. And what a wicked sense of humor he has.
Yes.
I mean, of course, there's the part when you ask him in the documentary, you talk about the spiritual healer, or where he was asked him what his name was, and Robert has the tears flowing. Yeah. You see what a deep person he is. And then there's so many times in the documentary where you're talking to a member of King Crimson, a current member, and Robert is the headmaster looking over your shoulder saying, "That's not true.
Yes,
that's bollocks. That's a terrible question." And if you watch Robert's hysterical videos with Toya, which pop up daily on YouTube, you see Robert Fripp, unbeknownst to the public before your documentary or even before he started doing these YouTubes, he's a real funny guy.
Yes, he does. He's got an immaculate sense of humor. It's not always apparent, however, because I think one of the things that I experienced on tour with them is that the music comes first.
Well, sure.
So there are times for gags, and he has this, at its best, I think he has this extremely dry sense of humor. My mother used to have a very dry sense of humor. I used to describe it as being so dry that she made jokes 5 years ago that I've only just started to find funny. And Robert has a similar sort of delayed approach to his humor as well, which I was very keen to get across. I mean, that before the film came out, I think that Robert had just this reputation, as Bill Bruford put it, as being like a cross between Salvador Dali, Mahatma Gandhi. Sorry, no, Mahatma Gandhi. So Robert was described by Will Bruford as being a cross between Joseph Stalin, Mahatma Gandhi, and the Marquis de Sade. And it was important to me to both provide evidence of why people might think that's the case, but also to provide a much broader spectrum of the man, because I'm not interested I'm not interested in telling an audience what to think. I'm interested in giving an audience an opportunity to make up their own minds. And in order to do that, you have to give them the best evidence available.
Yeah.
However, if you go back to the first record, meaning Giles, and Fripp, that was extremely comedic.
Yeah.
That was very off the cuff, funny. So
much more akin to the Bonzo Dog Doodah Band.
Exactly. That same Viv Stanshell kind of a thing. But one of the things that struck me, and you were able to portray this by with Michael Giles, I mean, the Fripp that we thought he was goes all the way back as well. And then you have Trey or Adrian. What was it that Trey said? Something that it was like 10-year...
low-grade fever.
Low-grade fever for 10 years and such. But at the same time, when you see him, quote unquote, behind you and asking those questions, and then, of course, as Tom was saying, the Toya stuff, yeah, there's a lot of play involved, and he's not the dullard or the Hitlerian dullard that people would think.
No, I mean I'm not sure I'd bring Hitler into the mix there, but no, you only have to listen to King Crimson to understand that there is a very, very complex thought process in operation there. And that's not just to do with Robert, obviously, it's to do with other musicians. And I think that if there's a failing to the documentary, it's that I don't have more of what I wonder is Robert's true voice. And that is the extraordinary sound of his guitar. I did ask there's a lot of stuff's absent from the documentary because he fundamentally wouldn't answer the questions I asked him. And I did ask him if the guitar was, what came out of his guitar was his true voice. And it was, I can't remember if the question was brushed aside or reconfigured for me, or there's a number of options. You ever ask him a question which normally involves the question not being answered in one way or another. But he did say to me that you find the essence of King Crimson in the music, and I would like the audience for the film to consider whether you find the essence of Robert Fripp in that unique and quite beautiful otherworldly guitar sound.
Yes. It was interesting in the sense, I know how frustrating it must have been for you as an interviewer, because there's one clip where he says, well, that's a stupid question. Why don't you ask it? And you say, because I'm an effing moron or something like that.
Yes.
And so I could understand how you had to constantly rephrase questions to be more amenable to Robert, so you'd at least get an answer out of him.
Well, it's not really a question. Yes, I think that's not even the more amenable, but it was a question of, as you guys know, it's that some people you meet and you interview and it can be almost transactional. It's right. An exchange of quotes, and then other people it's more of a conversation. And with other people, it's more of a fucking struggle.
Yes.
Mentioning no names. And some people, it's like being repeatedly kicked in the balls.
Yes, it has. I'm thinking of one of our interviews in particular. You know who I'm talking about?
Well, David, we interviewed Ian Anderson, another brilliant musician, but he has a long, long reputation of being very difficult with interviewers. And every interviewer, including my friend and documentarian Derek Hanlon, who did the 25th anniversary video, VHS in those days, David, of Jethro Tull. Yeah, he was very, very difficult. But what's interesting, Toby, also fascinating about this documentary is when you interview the various current day members of King Crimson, like they're almost schoolboys hiding from the headmaster. They're like, well, Robert, blah, 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 blah. And it seems like he has this pervading, almost hovering over his band members. The only guy who seemed particularly comfortable with your questions, but was very guarded, was our friend Tony Levin, the bass player. He was very matter of fact, but you can see how guarded he was with his answers. But it seems like everybody in the current band of King Crimson, and we don't know the other ones, the other versions, they're kind of walking on eggshells. That's something I took away. David, you think, or Toby, any thoughts on that?
I have thoughts. I'm happy to wait for David's before.
David, your thoughts?
Okay, all right. So obviously, yeah, there's that, and I think it's just because he's going to see the outtakes and he's going to see what's been filmed. So yes, we should keep ourselves sort of in line, so to speak. Which at the same time, when you think of Adrian, it seemed to me that Adrian has a little bit of sour grapes. So to be able to do that, he was comfortable just telling the truth. Trey as well. But then again, they were no longer in the band. So,
and it's the truth as they saw it. I mean, obviously. There's three sides to every story. Yes.
Or in King Crimson's 19.
19 cents. But did you find the interview subjects to be guarded or a little more?
Initially, I mean, as gently as I possibly can, I will keep going until I get something that feels like the truth. And I wasn't interested in making a party political broadcast on the behalf of the Robert Fripp Party or any other member of the band or the band itself. I was there to give people who don't know what King Crimson is or is for an idea of particularly some of the ideas that percolate behind the band. So there was one member of the band who insisted on seeing the sections from the interview that I did with them in context. They didn't see the whole film and they wanted a couple of cuts made, which I was happy to make. I didn't feel that they changed the story in any degree. And that person may have been concerned about what Robert thought. I leave it up to the audience to work out who that person was. But with regard to your suggestion that being in the current band of King Crimson is akin to being in the surveillance state, I admit that there were times when it felt like that, but actually the really interesting thing, or one of the really interesting things about King Crimson is that even though that there is this kind of monstrous characterization of Robert as some kind of dictator, actually, when it comes down to it, it's much more a question of people censoring themselves, or Bill Rieflin says at the beginning of the film, the gift of King Crimson is the gift of responsibility. And also, as Trey says in the film, he's never heard Robert telling anybody what to play. So the thing that I think really gets to people in King Crimson is not necessarily so much Robert Fripp. It's that at some point you end up looking at a reflection of yourself in that space. And certainly when I was making the film, they'd not interfered creatively in the film whatsoever. At one point, I was talking to Robert and saying, well, I was thinking about approaching it this way, or maybe I was doing this way. And he just looked at me quite blankly and not with any kind of malice or anything. He just said, well, you're in charge. And that was the end of the conversation. There was nothing else of like, oh, I quite like if you know, that's it.
He trusted you.
Would he trust? Yeah. And I think that's the case with everybody in the band, that fundamentally he picks them to do, because he thinks that they will bring something that's appropriate to that space. But I don't think that, like, as I think about this, I have the sense that, like, if you said to him, should I play a G here or whatever, that you would certainly get a response that was irritable at best. Sure. But it would, because people would be like, well, you work that shit out, not me. It's like, that's what you have.
Right. Well, if you think about it,
I think Toby, you can drive yourself mad in that place as well.
When Mel Collins says, I did a C sharp instead of a C, or was it a C instead of a C sharp?
It was the other way around, but yes.
I think that was, you're right about that, where the personal responsibility, he wasn't saying, oh, they're going to be upset with me for doing that. It's, I made the mistake. I'm responsible. And the other thing I found fascinating, Toby, was, for me, having grown up with King Crimson, and let's talk the music for a second. If you think about all of the original bands from the prog era, like Genesis, Gentle Giant, and on and on and on, Genesis is a really good example of a band that became a pop band where King Crimson stayed the way they always were. Sure, the music changed, but the integrity and
the aesthetic of King Crimson. I mean, they did have a commercial popularity, if you will, in the early 80s. And that's one of the things and this is all my hypothesis, is that, and I remember seeing King Crimson in 1980, the Adrian Belew, Tony Levin version. And I think that's great that how Bill Bruford, in your interview with him, said the difference between the English and the Americans, where the English, the Fripp and Bruford, would sit there and talk incessantly over the concert and go over every little detail. And Tony Levin and Adrian Belew would go out and have hamburgers and play pool. Just so very American. I remember seeing Adrian Belew version of that, and he was very theatrical. He was a flamboyant frontman just by his own nature. And they had a couple of radio or MTV hits, I think. Can't recall the songs now. Heartbreak, I think, was one of them. Heartbeat. It was. Yes, yeah. And it was almost like King Crimson was treading into that MTV rock star, pop star waters, even though their record was still King Crimson. And I think maybe that might have put Robert off a little bit because that was more of a commercial pop version of King Crimson. And if you go back and listen to Exposure, the album starts off with a diatribe from Robert Fripp, and this is circa 1979, of him not wanting to be commercial. And of course there was a time when King Crimson was inactive for many years. I wonder if the King Crimson finally getting back together was that they were seen in the public differently now as a legacy artist, and it was okay to be King Crimson because they knew they had their fan base and they could sell X amount of records. And one of the things you also show in the film is how loyally dedicated their fan base is. King Crimson is the soundtrack to their lives.
The provider of a peak experience.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Right. Peak experience. Yes.
And the audience was primarily male.
I disagree with that. This is one of the prejudices that people have about King Crimson, and actually, particularly in Italy and in the UK, actually, it's predominantly male, but it's not dominated by men.
We have a girl, the woman that has a crush on Tony Levin. I thought that was a fabulous little. We'll have to ask Tony about that.
Yeah, I thought there was something lovely about that because I was expecting, a more, if you like, male answer.
Right.
But it's the infectiousness of her laugh and the self-awareness there and the shyness of the smile of the girl next to her.
What was Tony's reaction to that clip? Did he see it?
I haven't actually.
We'll have to ask him.
To Tony about that.
I can't wait to ask him that question and kind of rub it in at the same time.
Like Novocaine into a gum.
That's exactly right.
Exactly right. Yeah, I got Jocko, the singer, who has tremendous amount of pressure. I saw just before COVID, I saw that version of King Crimson, and a lot of pressure on him, David, to sing not only Greg Lake and to sing, I guess Boz Burrell did a little bit of vocals on King Crimson, John Anderson, and then of course Adrian Belew. And you talk about a guy who's got Gordon Haskell. Right. And of course, John Wetton. You talk about a player who has I think he's got the most pressure in King Crimson because people are so beholden to those songs. And somehow Jocko was able to capture the essence of what these vocalists were about. And you really showed that in the film also.
Because I'm a sort of caveman when it comes to music, and my musical tastes are sort of quite caveman-like as well, generally speaking. I don't feel particularly well qualified to talk about the musical aspects of the band, but it's my sense with Jacko, he serves the songs, not the singers. Yes. He has his own voice, but it's one that's appropriate to that spread of the band's oeuvre. And I think it seems to me that rather you refer to them as sort of suggesting that maybe this iteration of the band is more of a legacy type thing. And I mean, I suppose that there is, for starters, if you've been like me, been making incredible fucking music for 50 years, I don't think you can be blamed for wanting to play some of the early stuff that's incredible, as well as some of the later stuff that's incredible. Right. And I think it's also worth stressing that there are 3 fucking drummers in the in the mix as well, which does change the music quite significantly. Sure. Those, I think it's one of the things I found really interesting about working with Crimson and sort of coming to terms with a genre that I'd never really paid any attention to because I was brought up by punks, is that, and prog was the enemy, is that
that's a fascinating story right then and there. So you grew up in the 70s.
Yeah.
Okay, and mom and dad were punks?
No. But I was like, my dad was really into disco, and my mum liked classical and Rod Stewart.
Okay, that's a good comment.
And you went after the Buzzcocks.
Well, yeah, but I just like I grew up in the sort of like the older boys. They weren't like I didn't have a brother, but they were like my older brothers. They were punks, and then I'd be listening to the radio and I'd hear Johnny Rotten sort of dismissing all of these ancient dynasties.
But that was almost more of a social movement than a musical one, yes? I mean, wasn't it the whole punk movement? Because if you look at some of the more, let's say, and punk is kind of a weird word anyway. If you look at artists such as Elvis Costello and Graham Parker and even Mick Jones of The Clash, they grew up on 60s music. As a matter of fact, I think Elvis Costello's favorite artist, according to his autobiography, was Crosby, Stills, and Nash. And artists such as Nick Lowe, they were accomplished players where the attitude was with punk, or the one that was projected in the media was like, oh, we just know 3 chords. No, these guys knew a lot more than 3 chords.
Well, to be fair, you're talking about, broadly speaking, more supposed new wave artists,
right? More
than punks. Names. But no, my lot were real. In inverted commas, quite nihilistic punk rockers. But the point I was going to make anyway is that all the bands that you listed, they're prog bands, and as you say, like with the example of Genesis, and to some extent, yes, that they went on to become sort of pop bands. And this is something that I sort of learned from having discussions with Robert, that he dislikes that term because the genre is of itself limiting.
Yes.
And the irony is when you refer to it as prog, it sort of stops. It's like ring-fenced. Whereas what's interesting about King Crimson is that there is a consistency to what it is, although it's very hard to define. Right. At the same time, it is progressive by nature in that it keeps evolving. And even the point at which it is like, maybe it's not apparently active in creating new music, its approach to the old music is also progressive and evolving. It's the introduction of 3 drummers. So I think that's something that I found really interesting. And I think, to me at least, and I'm not well versed in the genre, because I'm 55 and I do not have time for 8-minute long songs. But they seem to be interested in trying new things. And I've said this before, but certainly the Discipline band, as far as I'm concerned, has much more in common with what we in the UK call post-punk than it does progressive rock.
Right, exactly. It did, right, even though it retained that aesthetic. It seems to me that watching this documentary, Robert Fripp is very much a band leader like Miles Davis. Miles Davis did not like to be called jazz fusion. Matter of fact, on his early so-called fusion records, he put directions in music. And David, the documentary about him, The Isle of Wight, he refused to be called jazz. He says, call it anything you like at some point. And yes, I can understand where Robert Fripp feels confined by the definition of prog rock, because even like you say, post-punk, well, let's go back to 1980. That was the sounds. Robert lived in New York City for a while. He came here during the punk era. He lived in Hell's Kitchen. That's when he did his Exposure record. He worked with Daryl Hall, and he did The Roaches. And I think he did another record. I can't remember who.
He worked with Blondie as well. And,
Blondie, right? He was on the,
Also, he told me about kicking Philip Glass out of the studio at one point. He also made records with The Damned and played live with The Damned. I don't know if you're aware of that. So there were 2 punks in King Crimson, Bill Rieflin and Robert Fripp.
Yeah, that's very good.
Toby, it's interesting to me that you mentioned The Damned, because The Damned and the Sex Pistols, as far as I was concerned, were 2 of the biggest scams that the punk movement, the Pistols could play. The idea of punk being all do-it-yourself and slaggers just picking up an instrument and going for it was so... Malcolm McLaren tried to make that into a reality with the Pistols, but when you listen to that, the first album, the only album, those guys could play. The Damned as well. And the Damned proved that when they started doing Tunes by Love and things of that. These guys actually, Captain Sensible and all, they could play. They really could play. And
you're both musicians, right?
Yes, we're bass players, but don't hold that against us.
I thought you said you were musicians.
No. We strap these things on our bodies. See,
Look at that hideous.
Okay.
Look at that beautiful six
and
string.
I use pink strings because it takes a tough man to wear pink.
See, my instrument, I just have a plain old Fender bass, Dave. I'm a man of the people, the proletariat's bass.
That's it.
Well, I used to be a bass player.
Oh, what happened? Where did you go wrong?
Smart.
It's honestly, like, there was a point where I had a Rickenbacker copy that somebody had given me.
Carlo Robelli?
And the neck, I had no idea. And the neck was so bent that I could barely get my fingers onto the fretboard with the strings underneath them. And I was so poor at the time, I was a teenager. I used to get the guitarist to tune it up an octave to make up for the fact that the strings were so
So you played
saggy.
a piccolo bass.
It was basically impossible to play, so it put me off as a result. But I did develop very strong left.
And you look great.
See, that's the thing. Your chops will improve when you have a shitty instrument because you have to fight the damn thing.
Absolutely. But that all said, with regard to the punk thing, you're absolutely right. I mean, Steve Jones he's a brilliant guitar player. It's very simple, but really great. But there's a lot of overdubbing in Never Mind the Bollocks. Yeah, and the Damned, fucking incredible. You know, they put that first album together, recorded it in a day.
Wow.
You know, imagine how tight you have to be able to do that. I mean,
exactly.
But it was the whether you could play thing or not. I don't think that's so much more. Was too important to punk. Although I think it's very threatening and as a result good for people who put too much store into playing. I remember going to see an anarchist punk band called Flux of Pink Indians play in Evesham Town Hall. And at one point, something went wrong, and one of them had to do some tuning on stage. And someone in the audience just shouted, "Muso!" But also, as I'm sure you guys are aware, there's a small c conservatism and pomposity and inertia that can come along with being too good.
Oh, we know all about that. Yes.
At your instrument. There's a band that I'm very fond of called The Beat Happening, who they were so punk rock that they used to change instruments after every song.
Excellent.
In case they got too good. Because there's that it's to do with that suspicion of not retaining the need for evolution and development and change. I think that's where it comes from. It's not so much a Luddite thing. It's just a suspicion of what can come with a degree of technical sophistication. And the other thing that I was going to say, and this, let's be honest, this is coming from somebody who is a dreadful musician, although I have been paid for making music. I'm basically a net, is that to get to a basic standard where you could play, I'd say you play bass in the top 40 band, for example. Right. That would take anybody from knowing nothing to being able to do it. What, 4 months? Would you think that's a reasonable No virtuosity, but in terms of being able to just do it, you could probably get there in 4 months, wouldn't you say?
I think I
disagree.
I'm just saying this to wind you guys up, obviously.
Good. That's good. This is Toby's next documentary. But I understand what you're saying about the simplicity of the instrument. I'll say top 40. I mean, I worked my way through college playing top 40 music, and it was difficult. It was Donna Summer, it was George Benson, and it was Blondie, and you had to jump from style to style. But I can understand. Yeah. We've spoken to many accomplished bass players, among them Michael Manring and Larry Grenadier, two jazz giants right now, contemporary. And yes, they picked up the electric bass. It was easy. It was 4 strings, 12 notes. And voila, within a couple of weeks, they were on the bandstand playing. So I can understand that.
But again, I'm not talking about virtuoso playing.
Right. Just get through the song.
There is but I think that's also absolutely one of the great things about rock and roll, and this is something that the punk sort of exemplified and exaggerated was the accessibility of it, and there's a sort of a certain degree of anti-elitism that comes along with that. Sure. And certainly to a teenage boy is extremely attractive.
A lot of social political muster behind that, more than just playing.
And you can get girls. You're in a band.
Yeah, there is that as well. Speaking of the Damned, by the way, you know that they just reformed and Brian James is playing with them again. Yeah.
Yes.
Which is very exciting.
Yeah. I just saw their documentary over the COVID period. Don't remember the name of it, but it was pretty good. And then I
don't watch music documentaries.
Well, my wife's a documentarian, so we watch it for a couple of reasons. to see what's out there and to see what not to do.
Getting back to King Crimson, again, I know you don't watch music documentaries, or you don't claim to. I've watched several of them. Not anymore. But what I enjoyed about this, it was much more insightful to the band than the usual documentaries with the guys backstage, everybody having a beer, a few celebrities come behind scenes. This was a music documentary that really didn't have much music. It was much more about the personalities and the whole aesthetic of King Crimson.
Fucking dare you.
Yeah, how dare you?
It's full of music. There is literally approximately 1 minute and 45 seconds that doesn't have music in there.
Really? Because I guess I'm just so focused on the interviews. The interviews are so riveting that I forgot about the music. Shame on me.
The music permeates the whole film.
Yeah, I guess.
There are 2 moments where silence is significant.
Right.
But no, you're right. You're right. It is it's because it's, unless I was going to make a concert film, it may not surprise you to know that King Crimson, a certain person in particular, a little bit touchy about having cameramen near them. It was that I wanted to focus on the personalities, because we go into the cinema, and this is a work of cinema, we go in the cinema to see, to some extent, our humanity reflected back on us. And so that's why I focused on the humanity in King Crimson and the conflicts inherent in that and the sort of transcendent elements of that, because that's how I get an audience to engage.
Right.
But implicit in that as well is that if you want to know why all this struggle is worth it, then you listen to the records.
Right.
But I can't sufficiently well replicate the experience of listening to Red for the first time on headphones in a cinema, because that's a very specific and personal
right,
experience. So the goal of the film to some degree is to get people to listen to King Crimson.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And also mortality is a theme through this film, I feel. Obviously, look, I'm 62. I've been a King Crimson fan. So I look pretty good.
Fucker, aren't you?
Yeah.
Not like my partner's 3 minutes older than dirt over there. We're best of friends. There is a sense of mortality. I mean, you see Robert constantly practicing, and Robert's getting close to 80, and we're talking about the end of the road here in some respect. You see, obviously, Rob Reiflin passes during the making of the film, or from the time, obviously, in when you guys, I guess, were in production. And that King Crimson, we hope they'll be around much longer, but really, how much longer than they have? I mean, mortality certainly plays a role in all of that. So it's kind of, you see that even with Tony, who we spoke to about, maintaining good health. And he says, I have my good days and my bad days. So
Jacko tells a great story about them playing, I think it was in Syracuse, at some hall, and there's a picture of this orchestra in there playing. And Tony said to Jacko, "That's me." He points out the bass player in the orchestra. And Jacko said to me, "Do you know who was conducting that orchestra?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Stravinsky." It's another of one of the many failings of the film that I've made, that it's not apparent. But I was struck by the irony of working with King Crimson. The film starts, and no one, not a single critic, nobody in the podcast, no one has mentioned the fact that the film starts with an image of a skull with a metronome in it. and I wanted, when I put that image in there, I was like, because it lasted for a bit longer, I was like, I'll just put it in there really quickly because it's so crass and it's so obvious. But the film is, people said, what's this film about? I said it's an examination of the human condition using King Crimson as the medium. It's deeply pretentious, but it's also true from my point of view. And one of the first things I noticed was lots of members of the band passed away.
Sure.
So the shadow of death is already hanging over the band. One of the members of the band that I was introduced to was terminally ill when I met them. Two past members of the band died whilst I was still making the film, Gordon Haskell and Ian MacDonald.
Right.
And as you said, everybody's getting on. And I'm 55. I lost my mother at the start of the pandemic. I lost my sister a few years ago. And one of the things that their passings has taught me is that the only resource that is truly precious is time. And it's not something that you want to waste. And that's why I'm not interested in making VH1 type rock documentaries. Right. I'm interested in the human condition, and I'm interested in working with artists that have something to say about the human condition. The irony of working with King Crimson in this context, with this cute, exaggerated awareness of mortality, is that they're constantly arguing about tiny increments of time. And my original vision for the film was just as sort of the camera circling around these endless backstage corridors in Poland or Germany or Italy or England or Tokyo, and coming around the corner, and there's yet another argument between all of these, relatively elderly gentlemen talking about these tiny thing.
And as you mentioned in the documentary, these guys are the best at what they do in the world.
Yeah.
It's funny to me. I mean, I don't even come near the musicianship of King Crimson. And I think, my God, these guys are arguing over minutia. I mean, for God's sakes.
Yeah. And whether the audience knows this or not, it's sort of,
not at all.
There's really something else. And what was fascinating to me wasn't the mortality. It was the fact that, and Robert was the perfect example, he was practicing, still needed to improve it. And as he said in the film, I'm getting closer.
Yes. Yeah.
But the beautiful part is his humbleness to the fact, and his humility, I'm not there. Here's a gentleman who has changed the course of musical history, and he's getting closer. That's where the minutia comes in, and that's something the Stones are still performing. My God, they're old men too.
Well,
but
you mentioned with Fripp rehearsing it, and he even says it, as you alluded to, that the audience wouldn't notice when he says, "Well, I'm working on different fingering positions." He goes, "It'll change the sound." He goes, the audience won't know it. Now, most performers, David and myself, are, well, if the audience doesn't know it, that's, we got one off on them. Robert, even if the audience doesn't recognize it, it means something to him to get even a better finger configuration on a song that he's...
But Tom, even more to the point is that change in fingering, as he says, will take him a year.
Yes,
So he's not even looking from a mortal coil.
Yeah, I guess not.
He's looking, all right, so I'll get that done by next year, and the next thing I'll do the next year. That's a beautiful way, and it's something that I think creative artists share.
Absolutely. Toby, what did Toya think of the film?
I'm not going to comment.
Was she wearing clothes when she saw it?
Yes, she was.
I'm not going to comment.
We're also friends. We're also friends with Toya's former bass player, by the way, Phil Spalding. So if you're keeping tabs, and there's a guy worthy of a documentary. Now, the hard copy version of this, what are we going to see? There's additional footage, right? And
it's available on the digital video disc that's coming out.
Right.
I think there's a low carb version, and then there's a full fat version, which has, because the film was made twice, effectively. The first version of it, which had the title, which I still miss, which is Cosmic Fuck Prog Rock Pond Scum Set to Bum You Out.
Can't imagine why they wouldn't go with that, David.
Well, it's
a ring to it, I think.
Honestly, we are wondering if we can get away with renaming it that again. That was much more of a kind of expressionistic response to my experience with King Crimson, and also Robert had not really. I felt an obligation to finish the film, but it was at a point where Robert had not really engaged with the camera and the interview process. So the sort of the fuller portrait that we were discussing at the beginning of the conversation was not there in that version of the film, and it was not necessarily a comfortable watch as a result. Although it did have some very funny bits in it, and as I said, it was much more expressionistic. Where this has got a more kind of mature and coherent narrative. So, but fortunately, with the DVD, that we can sort of include some of those other sort of bits which are maybe not significant in terms of the story, but they're just funny to watch. So they're coming out with a.
Will we be seeing
DVD.
Splashing with King Crimson?
You've done some research.
As little as possible.
No, it's those two. filmic approaches have not coincided yet.
Okay. What's next on the...
I'm just waiting for somebody else to ask me to make a film, give me several £100,000 and not interfere with the creative process whatsoever, which is exactly how I made this film. And it's like, as I say that sentence, I'm like, I can't believe how fortunate that I was. I mean, it was... Yeah. Let me be clear. This was not an easy film to make. It was an absolute fucking bastard of a film to make. And nevertheless, I'm very grateful and appreciative of being able to have made it. And as I said, I mean, I'm sincere in this. There's been no interference whatsoever. There was some grumbling after the film went over budget twice, but no interference whatsoever. So I would love to make another film like this, but the circumstances under which I made this film and the responses to the film have been great so far were that they gave me a significant amount of money, far less, I should add, than a traditional sort of Netflix-type documentary.
Sure, yeah.
But still a decent chunk of money and did not interfere whatsoever and also allowed the film to come into being at its own pace. As David Singleton, the manager, put it to me, we've always approached this from the point of view of we make the art and then we work out how we make money from it. And I think that as a punk, albeit a posh one, I think I'm very keen to broadcast to as many people as possible that King Crimson are living proof that you can make art for the sake of making art and make it financially sustainable. And I think it's really important to recognize that. Really important.
I think that's great. I think that's fabulous. Do you have anything in particular that you're thinking if I write you a check today, it's a blank check,
which we can't see on the radio?
I would love to make a film about the Cramps, which are my favorite band. But Lux is no longer with us, and I think Poison is keen to move on with her life. So I don't know if that's a possibility. Otherwise, you know what, between you and I read an interview with Rod Stewart yesterday, and I thought, Rod would probably be a lot of fun to make a film with.
I think he would. As a matter of fact, David and I interviewed one of his former bass players and musical director, Carmen Rojas, and he would be a great on-camera presence for you.
Have you had Guy Pratt on your podcast?
We'd love to have him. I'm a big fan of his. I read his book is phenomenal, and I do listen to the Martin Kemp podcast, and we're on his trail. He's on tour with Nick Mason.
I think they just finished, so
we'll have to get a hold.
We'd love to talk to him.
It would be funny to have the three of you.
We've had quite a few bass players on Ron Carter. We've had Bruce Thomas from the Attractions.
Have you had Gail Ann Dorsey?
Not yet. I know Gail. I was going to London a couple of years ago before David and I started the show. I have a website and a video platform called Know Your Bass Player. And I interviewed Chris White, the late, great Jim Rodford, John Bentley from Squeeze, Mickey Feet, Steve Bingham, who was with Colin Blunstone. I've done a lot of bass player interviews. And David and I, when we started this show, it was the Bass Guitar Channel. So we go back to, who do we Leo Lyons from 10 Years After. There's a name you don't hear much.
And Toby, one of the great things about COVID is that everyone was home and everyone wants to talk about themselves. So we just kept calling people and everyone said, sure, why not?
Yeah, but the Rod documentary would be great.
Just everybody. It was great.
We just did we actually have a Notes from an Artist orchestra, and we did a tribute reinventing the music of Rod Stewart, and that was a lot of fun. About Faces, we call that. And interesting enough, you talk about amateurs and professionals and the synergy between the two. David and I have been involved with a lot of the fringe musicians who were left over from the 60s and 70s in the East Village. And we've been combining, David and I are somewhat musos. David went to Berkeley, I went to University of Miami.
No shit.
Look at that.
I got thrown out before it did me any harm, so
yes,
I'm okay.
Luckily. And we've been actually combining the muso approach with some of the East Village art scene. And it's really some extraordinary results from it, because these are the last people standing from the 60s and 70s that weren't priced out of Manhattan thanks to rent stabilization and things like that. And we've been bringing our muso approach down there. We've been doing shows at the Cutting Room and City Winery and the Bitter End, of course, a legendary place. Yeah, and it's kind of interesting to see just how simpatico everyone is. And when they let down their guard of who's a muso and who's an artist, everybody's trying to do the same thing.
We've been talking about genres and levels of proficiency and so on, but but I think that, at the risk of sounding too pat, music is a universal language. It really does. It does bring people together. And as Robert points out on several occasions, music doesn't really exist without an audience. So no matter how fucking good you are at playing the bass or the guitar or whatever, you're just pissing into the wind if nobody's hearing it. And that makes the audience as important as in the process. And my sort of main interaction with music has been as a DJ. And I think so it's all of these barriers are less important. What matters is the communication that music allows.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, the end result always.
Yeah,
it's a wonderful
Although
thing.
nobody needs 6 strings on their bass.
Well,
nobody but me.
Before we let you go,
Don't
just
get me
speaking about
started on the sticks either.
Speaking of a 6-string, you'll enjoy this story, Toby. We interviewed Bruce Thomas, and Bruce Thomas is also a writer, Elvis Costello Attractions. And he did research on us, and he saw David with a 6-string bass. And he says, what is that? A coffee table. So all our bass colleagues, and I'll send you a link to this.
Wagon.
We fixed this. All our bass colleagues here in New York City took their respective instruments and made coffee tables out of them. They put drink and food on them, and we put a nice big collage together, and we sent it back to Bruce Thomas saying, all right, here you go. Here's your coffee tables, and you'll enjoy it. I'll send the link to Glass Onion.
What everyone forgets is that the 4 strings in the middle
He's defending
are still the same 4 strings. So everyone thinks, oh, God, 6 strings. He's going to have diarrhea of the hands. The thing is, though, you can go lower. And
See what you started, Toby. See what you started.
Yeah. No, I've had my stick lessons. So
slowly I turn, step by step, inch by inch.
And actually, Toby, it's funny you said that because Ian bought me a stick. 3 weeks later, I saw my very first 6-string bass hanging in a window on 48th Street. And I said, I could do that and not have to learn this crazy new instrument. Gave the stick back to Ian and picked up my first 6-string bass, and it's been love ever since.
It does look pretty. I'll give you that.
Yes.
It looks pretty. Well, there you go. That's what we're going to end this interview on. Toby, thanks for talking. This will be on the air on Monday, so hopefully we'll help you sell some DVD box sets, and
Thank you very
maybe,
much.
who knows, somebody will show up with a check.
Before we've got New York screenings coming up.
Oh, when is that?
On the 20th and 23rd of November at the Metrograph Cinema.
Okay, yeah.
Are you going to be here?
I'm gonna see if I can get there for the 23rd.
Okay.
I used to live in New York, so I've got lots of friends there.
Great.
I sold out.
23rd Thanksgiving?
It's the day before, I believe. I think Thanksgiving was the 24th.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Our families don't like us, so we never go to Thanksgiving. Yeah, let us know. Let us know through Billy, and we'll
all right.
see you. All right. Toby, thanks for everything.
What a pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now.
Bye.
Was that the most incredible selection of tunes? And before that, was that just an incredible interview with Toby Amies?
It was incredible, David, and I'll tell you something. Our listeners, our viewers, our viewer, they're going to really love this documentary. It is something that really bears repeated viewing and listening, and the same with Toby's interview. There's so much depth here. And as we were just saying, Robert Fripp really is a very courageous man to stick to his convictions about putting the music first and worrying about commerce later, which is so unlike the business that is rock and roll, and that is the music business.
Absolutely. I am just thoroughly beholden, really, to this documentary to sort of get my thoughts together. In the last years of our lives, not wanting to be maudlin, and isn't it about time we actually do musically what we were put on this earth to do? It's no longer about creating income because we either have it or we don't, and whatever we're doing now is what we're doing now. But truth be told, it really hit home to me about how directly responsible, disciplined the King Crimson Group really is.
And passionate.
What they want is great music first. And speaking of great music first, I wanted to talk about our playlist. Now, folks, this is the first time we've actually done the interview as a whole and then all the selections of tunes. We felt that was an easier way to go because you really don't want to stop in the middle of the interview because there's so many great points being made. So let me tell you, so you have the set list in front of you, exactly what you were listening to. We started with Lark's Ton Part 2 from the King Crimson record, Lark's Ton and Aspic. We then hit Robert Fripp's solo record and did the Robert Fripp with Daryl Hall tune Exposure, which is also the name of that record. We then went all the way back to the beginning with Giles, Giles, and Fripp, the Newlyweds. Giles, Giles, and Fripp was the name of that record. We did the Adrian Belew tune from his album, The Lone Rhinoceros, the tune Lone Rhinoceros. We then jumped to Ian MacDonald, my brother-in-law, and Michael Giles' record, MacDonald and Giles, a tune called Tomorrow's People. Then we did something from the Bruised Romantic Glee Club, Jocko Jaczyk's Large. Then we hit a little more King Crimson with Elephant Talk. Tony Levin's Stickmen did Relentless. We did the Bill Rieflin, Trey Gunn, and Robert Fripp record, The Repercussions of Angelic Behavior, and that was part 1. And we finished off with 2 more King Crimson tunes. The pop hit, if you could call it such, Heartbeat, and we ended with the very beginning of King Crimson, In the Court of the Crimson King. Pretty good, Tom, huh?
Pretty good. I love downloading our own playlist, David. Thanks, everybody, for listening. You can listen to us on Cygnus Radio every Monday night at 8 p.m. That's www.cygnusradio.com. If you miss our radio show, David, you can subscribe to our podcast. It's absolutely free where all our content resides. You can find Notes from an Artist podcast on Buzzsprout, Spotify, Amazon, Apple Music, and other platforms where podcasts are podded. We also have a YouTube channel, David. I don't know if you watch us on YouTube. Aptly named Notes from an Artist. You can see highlights from some of our interviews and see what we look like, see what our interview subjects look like, see how shocked they are when they actually have an intelligent interview to participate in. We have a website, notesfromanartist.com, and that's all the news that's unfit to print regarding our radio shows and podcasts. Don't forget about the Notes from an Artist Orchestra. In the waning days of 2021, David and I put together a fabulous musical ensemble which performs in New York City and areas connected to New York City. And don't forget about the Notes from an Artist Orchestra, David, with you and I in the bass chair. We have musicians who have worked with such renowned artists as Bob Dylan, Miles Davis, Ian Hunter, The Clash, Lenny Kaye, who was a guest on our show, Ashford and Simpson, Lou Reed, Garland Jeffries, Hall & Oates. We're performing in and about New York City. Some of our performers even performed on Broadway in London's East End, David. Quite a itinerary, and that's all on our website. You can find out where our gigs are. Follow us on Facebook. And for you musos, we have a section called Tips from the Top, where you can learn music lessons from Ron Carter, Dave Swift, Michael Manring, among others, not above others. And
well, it could be above others if they have their screen on the ceiling.
Heaven above. So check out Tips from the Top. It's all on www.notesfromanartist.com.
And what are we doing next week? I think we have a Rolling Stone in our view.
Coming up next, we got Bill Wyman. We're going to talk about Bill Wyman, and we're going to also talk about Fleetwood versus Mac, which is also the theme of one of the Notes from an Artist Orchestra's performances. So
that'll be our Christmas show, December 10th, at the Stitch Bar in New York City.
In New York City, conveniently located in New York City's Garment District.
So that way you don't even need to wear a coat. Just go to the Garment Center and buy one.
There you go. Schmatas aplenty. All right, folks. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.
Bye now.